Hello. Well, we are going to begin with this breakout session. Thank you for everyone for being here. The theme is going to be Ukraine, liberal courage against collectivism, genocide, by Dr. G. Palmer. Dr. Palmer is an executive vice president for international programs at ALAS Network, where he holds the George M. Geiger Chair for Advancing Liberty. He is also a co-author with Matt Werner of Development with Dignity, Self-Determination, Location, and the End of Poverty. That is this book that you have right here. He is also a senior fellow of the Cato Institute. So I give the floor to Mr. Tom, and I will ask you first for an applause.
Well, thank you so very much. One of the things that I'm going to convince you of is that the fight in Ukraine is not only about Ukraine and Ukrainians. I think this is easier for this audience, but I've spoken to many other audiences as well to explain to them that this is really a collectivist assault on the liberty of us all. It is not, as it's sometimes portrayed, some border dispute in a distant country. I'd also like to mention another thing. I have decided there's one exception to the non-aggression principle, and that is you should all be compelled to buy this book. It's a small, frankly, really small deviation. But if you are compelled to buy the book, read it, life will be better. Everything will taste better, colors will be brighter, your life will be totally transformed. But let's start then with what happened on February 24. The armed forces of the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine, but we need to be very clear. This did not start a war. The war has been going on since 2014. When the Russian Federation invaded Ukraine, occupied and annexed parts of that country, and ever since then regularly have been killing Ukrainians, shelling them, and attacking them. So the war was escalated dramatically, but it did not begin. Let's look at 2014, the first phase of the invasion. The Kremlin claimed that what they call Ukrainian nationalists, now they use the word Nazis, were murdering Russian children, and they were just acting to defend their ethnic comrades. By the way, there's a word for that from previous history, unsere Volksgenossen, our ethnic comrades. This is precisely the National Socialist justification for invasion of Czechoslovakia and Poland and other countries. There's no difference. They even claimed, and this went all the way up to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that a Russian boy had been publicly crucified by Ukrainians. This was not true, has been debunked repeatedly, but it persisted in this ecosphere. They deployed then thousands of soldiers with no insignia in Crimea, the Little Green Men. They conquered the peninsula, liquidated local leaders, dissolved the Tatar leadership and their own regional parliament, shut down all media, and then had a referendum with 96.77% in favor of joining the Russian Federation. This is impossible. Not merely unlikely, but impossible. The Tatar population alone is so much greater. Had they had a free voice, it's quite clear they would not have agreed with this. Later on, of course, after years of denial, President Putin said, well, of course they were Russian soldiers. The point being, you people who ever doubted it were idiots. Obviously, they were Russian special forces. They created these two people's republics that were separatist regions. This is a language that persists. These are just local people wanting their autonomy. Well, who were the leaders of the local people? The top one, Alexander Borodai from Moscow. an FSB agent, not from Donetsk, not a local person, became first prime minister of the Donetsk People's Republic, and the criminal and murderer below him, Igor Girkin, also known as the shooter, the man who boasted about bringing down the Malaysian airliner, killing all of those innocent people, a criminal who had been involved in a multitude of foreign wars, also an FSB man, also from Moscow, neither local separatist leaders. This was entirely manufactured. Now, there are people who believe, and with goodwill, that the Kremlin's war on Ukraine, it's not about ideas, it's not about ideology, it's just old 19th century geopolitics. And who is to blame for this? It's NATO and the United States, not Vladimir Putin or the Kremlin. And John Mearsheimer is, I think, the most notable and articulate and thoughtful proponent of this view. And you can read his articles. I encourage you to do so. He's an intelligent person. He's just wrong. He's wrong in the following regard. He never bothers to read and listen to what the Kremlin says. And I think that's important. That is important. So let's look, though, to how much truth there is to the thesis. Now, the Maidan protests that led to Viktor Yanukovych leaving the country, which are described as a coup d'etat by Mearsheimer. I don't think he understands what happened there. Yanukovych had, you know, the history, began to unleash the Berkut against the protesters, killing substantial numbers of people. It made Ukrainians angrier and angrier, and they did not back down. After signing an agreement that there would be elections, he left the country after being called by the Kremlin and left the room with the various ambassadors and other Ukrainian negotiators and came back, said, I'll sign. Went home and fled the country after burning papers and dumping some of them into the artificial lake he had created as a humble man with his own Spanish pirate ship with a disco dance floor on it. Many of these papers were later recovered and dried out in his sauna to reveal the extent of the financial corruption. He was not overturned, he left. The argument, though, was it was a coup and he was expelled. This is factually incorrect. He was the hand-picked man of Vladimir Putin, and we should be wanting to understand Putin portrays himself as a genius mastermind. He's a smart guy, but he screwed up. He picked the dumbest, greediest man in Ukraine to be the president, who thought he could be as rich as Putin without oil. Not possible. And he bankrupted the state. And when I talked to the Minister of Finance of Ukraine immediately following this, he said, you know, we went into the central bank, there's no foreign reserves, but there were file folders with papers with IOUs for hundreds of millions of euros. They just loaned them to the friends of the Yanukovych family. This quite primitive kind of bank bookkeeping. Nonetheless, they said it was a coup by NATO and the United States, and then they pointed out NATO expansion was a sore point. They demanded, Sergei Lavrov very clearly, Ukraine must never be allowed to join NATO, and then demanded the rollback of NATO, effectively the expulsion of 10 member states, those that had joined after 1997. This is not going to happen. But there's another element, which I'll talk about. Everybody knew Ukraine was not going to join NATO. Everybody knew that. It's in their constitution, it's an aspiration, and it wasn't going to happen. It might happen now, but it wasn't then. Because the first article of the North Atlantic Treaty states that the parties shall undertake to resolve or settle international disputes in which they may be involved by peaceful means. Well, certainly following 2014, there's no peaceful expulsion of the Russian army from Donbass or from Crimea. This disqualified Ukraine from membership, and everybody knew that. We should also remember that there was a signed memorandum, not a secret conversation, which is what Putin alleges about NATO expansion. The Budapest Memorandum, 1994, guaranteeing to respect the independence and sovereignty and the existing borders of Ukraine. United States, United Kingdom, and the Russian Federation were signatories to this treaty guaranteeing the existing borders of Ukraine. So it was the Russian Federation that broke a clear treaty and has acted lawlessly. So with all due respect to Professor Mearsheimer, and I do have respect for him, there's more at work here than he has accounted for. His realist school of international relations asserts states always act in their interests. Okay, maybe that's true. But then they acknowledge it's not true because if a state acts in a way not perceived to be in its interest, they criticize it and say you shouldn't do that. So let's take the quite disastrous US decision to invade Iraq. Mearsheimer and others opposed that, as did I. But their argument was states always act in their own self-interest, and you're not doing that. Well, a factual statement cannot generate an obligatory statement. So they make an is claim and somehow magically pop out an ought claim out of it. It's incoherent, in my opinion. Simply incoherent. What we ought to do, in addition to focusing on the interests of states and leaders, by the way, not states, but the decision makers of states, who are the relevant unit of analysis. States don't do things, people do. People make decisions within states. And sometimes they may harm the vast population in the interest of a small ruling clique, which is, I think, what's happening in Russia today. But we should also pay attention to what they say. And there is an ideology at work here of oligarchical collectivism, to use Orwell's phrase, which really captures it better than just collectivism. Oligarchical collectivism, or dictatorship versus liberty. The fundamental fact is that Vladimir Putin, who has worked very hard to create a dictatorship, cannot tolerate a functioning liberal democracy on his borders of his plantation. Russia is his plantation, and there are free people next door, and this is intolerable. It is an existential threat, particularly on the territory of a substantially Russian-speaking former Soviet republic. And Putin has put this very clearly. And again, it pays to go and listen to what he says. 2013, there was an interview, it's very carefully scripted, with journalists who I think were a little bit closer to actors, on RT, Russia Today. And he was asked, well, what are the fundamental significant ideological differences between the United States and Russia? Today, we don't have any significant ideological differences, such a reasonable person, but we have fundamental cultural differences. Individualism lies at the core of the American identity, while Russia has been a country of collectivism. He gives an example from the Gone with the Wind movie. Scarlett O'Hara says, I'll never be hungry again. This is the most important thing for her. Notice, she's a materialist. She just doesn't want to starve to death, which is a remarkably selfish thing. He says this is the most important thing for her. Russians have different, far loftier ambitions, more of a spiritual kind. It's more about your relationship with God. We have different visions of life. That's why it's very difficult to understand each other. But, here again, a little bit of acting, but it's still possible. Well, this version of oligarchical collectivism that's being built is, of course, phony. It's an oligarchy. The collectivism is for us. The oligarchical part is for the rulers. Putin is the richest human being on the planet. He has looted Russia for himself and his buddies. So collectivism is a tool to get the rest of us to think we're all part of a big common shared future, while the oligarchs live like oligarchs. Indeed, these are some of the rewards of collectivism's loftier ambitions of a spiritual sort. This is a small sampling of the super yachts that have been seized on sanctioned individuals. Imagine how much spirituality one could have on such a vessel, to be close to nature and to really experience your relationship to God while on one of these super yachts. So that's the loftier ambitions of a spiritual sort. Now, in addition to providing an ideological justification for dictatorship and rewarding the oligarchs, it's an ideological spur toward war. And I recommend going to the website of the President of Russia and reading what Vladimir Putin wrote on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. Blah, 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 spiritual, human, civilizational ties formed for centuries, etc., etc. Our kinship has been transmitted from generation to generation. It's very poetic and spiritual. It is in the hearts and the memory of people living in modern Russia and Ukraine, in the blood ties. Oh, we've heard that phrase before too, by the way. Blood. In the blood ties that unite millions of our families. Together we've always been and will be many times stronger and more successful, for we are one people. Not we could live together as two people and complement each other. We are one people. You are us whether you like it or not. That's the key message and takeaway. It doesn't matter what you want, because you are us. Under that approach, the consent of the people is irrelevant. What they want doesn't matter, because the Ukrainians are really us, regardless of what they may think or what they may desire. The article recently in the Russian Information Agency, in the Novosti, what should Russia do with Ukraine? Now notice, ponder that title for a moment. What should Russia do with Ukraine? Well, it argued the Ukrainians are all Nazis. They're passive Nazis. And why are they passive Nazis? The current Nazified Ukraine disguises Nazism as the aspiration to independence. Well, there you have it. If you aspire to be independent of the Russian Federation, you're a Nazi. Even though, as it points out, well, there's no Nazi party, there's no Führer, didn't mention the Jewish president, by the way, no racial laws, it's merely the desire to be independent makes Ukrainians passive Nazis, and the population must be purified. Again, quite redolent of a previous dictatorship on the European continent. And what has been the consequence? Murder, genocide, rape, assault, mutilation. The soldier I talked to who fought in Irpin said the savagery was unbelievable. The people who were raped, the cellars full of bodies with their hands behind their backs. He said they were so brutal, they executed the pets to wipe them off the face of the earth. This is the reality. That is what collectivism means. Now, how did it come to pass? Let me briefly talk about the way in which the state has created the social reality of the Russian people. Total monopolization of media. Now it is 100%. It was only 99.4 last year. It's 100% now. In contrast, in free societies, there's no coercive monopoly. We can come to some understanding of objective reality by hearing this view and that perspective and this, and sorting through it helps us to get to reality. Not possible in Russia. There you have the domination, RT, but then all of its spin-offs, and there are hundreds of them that most people don't know are Russian propaganda outlets, like In the Now, which is mainly cat videos, which I personally like. But then they slip in the Russian disinformation in between the cat videos to trick people like me. And there are lots of these. This is not unique. And behind it, always one view. So why is it a global struggle against collectivist totalitarianism, not just some little border dispute in some country that some people couldn't find on the map? The reason is we have seen the recrudescence of National Socialism. And I would have been shocked 20 years ago if you had said, oh, there will be a Nazi state again. But it has happened before our eyes. I recommend watching the videos with Alexander Dugin, an authentically crazy, highly intelligent, and thoroughly loathsome human being. As he points out, we have our Russian truth, and you must come to accept that. And then he added the little kicker, and we have nuclear weapons. It's quite clear. What is truth? Truth is what you believe, not what you can ascertain. He said, we believe in what we do, we believe in what we say, and that is the only way to define the truth. This is polylogism of the National Socialist sort. We have our Aryan truth, and the Jews have their Jewish truth. It's simply the same ideology. And Dugin has been promoting around the world this ideology of the alt-right. Here he is, founder of the National Bolshevik Party. Here he is with David Duke, his friend. Many of you may know who that is, the head of the Ku Klux Klan, who lives in Moscow, by the way. He may have moved recently, but he spent years there promoting this ideology, and now promoting a movement around the planet. And there are these weird so-called traditionalist cults in many, many countries that they are promoting. So the mere existence of what Ukraine as a free society is a threat. They're waging war on open and free societies. And it stands to your generation, very expansively, I include myself in that as one end of that cohort of people, to stand up against this, because Ukrainians are fighting for their liberty, but for ours as well.
So, up until the Euromaidan started, I was raised in a pro-Russian environment, and I also considered myself to be more of the Russian person than the Ukrainian. But then I saw that the Ukrainians are a very united nation and powerful when it comes to any problems, when it comes to resistance, that we have the idea that moves us, and we don't even need the leader to be together, to be united, to come to this idea.
What idea is that?
The idea of freedom, basically. It's so simple, but it's true. I mean, after the long years of Ukrainian history and struggles, we value freedom more than everything. And that's what we keep seeing now. That
What does freedom mean to you, though?
freedom is freedom to do whatever you want, to be whatever you want, to not be dependent on any circumstances or any decisions of some people in power. It's just this state when you can live and not survive, not exist.
Her point, not merely to exist, but to live your life. This is what Ukrainians are fighting for. To be able to just live your life and not live as other people tell you to live. Let me point out, I have never been prouder of European students' liberty than I am now. You were there when this was needed. I was in there at the factory with Tomek and our other friends making body armor for Ukrainians. That's my car that was obtained for me. And I know that Students for Liberty is standing up for liberty. So thank you all for what you are doing.
Okay, so now we are starting a round of questions, so raise your hand and we will take it.
Hello, thank you very much for this talk. I have a question. Some people say or believe even that Putin is a nationalist and a very strong patriot. And these are also the motivations why he's wanting to have back the Russian Empire. But then actually you say, no, that's not the case. If he would be really a patriot, if he would really be loving his people, then in all these years he was governing Russia with his intelligence, with all this power he has in that country. He would have freed up the real potential of Russia to really make it a wealthy country, but he completely failed. So what would you think? Does he actually like his Russian people? Is he a nationalist or patriot at all?
Nationalism is something that people can hold in their hearts, and it's also a tool that they can use against other people, sometimes even without believing it themselves. So let's ask the question, what would a patriot, even with ideas different from ours, right? So we could admit someone could feel patriotic and be a socialist or something else. What would that person do? Well, one thing is to acknowledge, I'm probably going to die at some point. Probably, right? So in my case, another 70, 80 years, and I might not be here. Putin never thinks about that. There's no succession plan. When he dies, it just stops. What will happen after that? Someone, again, not just a liberal, but someone with whatever ideology who had some sense of the interest of the nation would have a succession plan. Putin has zero. This tells us a lot. After me, I don't give a damn what happens. That's not any conceivable version of patriotism or national awareness. So I think this is largely a tool. I do think, I'm not a psychologist, but he seems like an authentic sociopath. George W. Bush, who said, I looked into his eyes and I saw his soul. And everyone I know who had spent time in Russia said, there's nothing there when you look in his eyes. He has the eyes of a KGB man. That's it. He's a sociopathic killer. That's who we have. But so I don't think that he is personally a nationalist per se. It's a tool for his power. And one thing he learned with the Russian population, this is not unique to Russians, victory in war boosts your popularity. In the technical language of political science, it's called a wargasm, right? People love it when you win. And Crimea was tremendous for him. Things are not been going so well. He needed another one. But I think he may have miscalculated in this case.
Thanks so much. I'm actually wondering, we now see a lot of policies are being rolled out, such as tax-funded weapons deliveries, economic sanctions against Russia, talks about banning the pro-Russian or pro-Russian war symbol of Z in Western countries. Now I'm seeing already the pictures what the correct libertarian response should be, but in terms of policy, what is the correct libertarian response?
I have a long catalog which I'll spend the next 4 hours saying all the correct responses. I'm not entirely sure. I'll just be very frank about this. Reasonable people can disagree on lots of matters when it comes down to policy. I do think that it is reasonable to provide aid, even taxpayer funded, because those taxes are there for the defense of European countries, and I think that the attack on Ukraine is an attack on the Baltics and on Poland and on other countries. And reasonable people could disagree with me on this question. But I think it's a little bit foolish to say, whoa, that person is being raped. If I call the police, oh man, that's taxpayer funded activity. I can't do that. I want to live in a more reasonable world where we do call the police and don't say I can't because someone paid taxes for it. And I think this is analogous in this context. In terms of other matters, the sanctions, I don't have a problem with sanctioning stolen goods. I think we should be careful and not sanction Russians per se. I know Russians who have made money honestly, and they don't deserve to be sanctioned. And they're not being generally. But all those super yachts were the property of criminals. They were ill-gotten gains. I don't have a big problem with that. But we should be very careful to draw the line and not sanction wealthy Russians per se. This would be an outrageous crime and lapsing into collectivism. With regard to the trade embargoes, there's an interesting thesis, the free trade piece, but when you dig down into the data, it turns out more trade between countries is conducive to peace when the trade is between private parties. Most of the exports from Russia are state assets. They have completely taken over the oil and gas sector. There's virtually no private firms left in that area. Yukos was the beginning of the renationalization. But unlike the previous Soviet state ownership, it's not a centrally planned chaos, which is what they had there. These are state firms run for private profit. Vladimir Yakunin is a good example of that. He was the head of the Russian state railway system, I think 8 years. And after 8 years, because he's a very clever man, he retired a billionaire. Isn't that amazing? That you run the Belgian state railway system for 8 years, and then it just turns out you're a billionaire at the end of it. This is how that system works. But it is still state assets, and these are state companies. And I don't think that the trade is analogous to blocking trade between private parties. So I think it's not unreasonable to embargo some of this trade. But it is a reasonable conversation to have, and I might be wrong about this. People can thoughtfully disagree. Finally, private persons can and should be involved in helping the Ukrainians. And so I've raised with my colleagues, as of last night, about $2.7 million for this. And with our Ukrainian friends, Natalia Melnik, who may be here. Is Natalia here? She's at another panel. She knows a lot about Ukraine and others. And by the way, Andreas right here, this man is a hero, bringing goods into Ukraine, all kinds of things. And we're careful we don't bring in anything that makes a bang bang sound, because I have an aversion to going to prison. But all the other non-lethal humanitarian life-saving aid we have been providing. And in other regards, there are people who can provide weapons. I'm not in that category to do that, but I'm happy other people are. And I think this kind of support is also of some significance.
Another question.
The microphone, okay.
Is it on? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for an inspirational discourse as ever from, well, my legend, Tom Palmer. But I wanted to ask, what can liberals do at an international level to approach this sort of might makes right approach, to, oppose this sort of might makes right reasoning, right? We saw that the Budapest Memorandum was forfeited, essentially, and Putin keeps saying, what are you going to do about it? I can keep destroying the Geneva Conventions. What are you going to do about it? Because it seems like the international level is essentially about states enforcing that international law. So what can we do to essentially change that, to prevent this sort of, blatant disregard?
I wish I had a simple answer to that, but I don't. But I do think that we have learned now the embarrassment of the German political leadership of thinking that they could just do normal business with this man. There should be a great deal of shame, but also learning in this process that the appeasement really had to stop. And also engagement with these Russian state enterprises. Nord Stream 2 was a disgrace, in my opinion. And it was authentically shameful that the German chancellor sold himself to the Russian dictator for so little money. Who knew you could buy a German chancellor for that small amount of money? I would have bought one if I had known. But this is shameful, and now we need to learn this lesson. But let me mention one more thing. And that is there is an ongoing Kremlin destabilization of liberal democracies. It is happening as we speak. Everywhere, in Greece, in Romania, in the United States, for the love of God, even Canada, my favorite country. And it's going on. How do they do it? Constant disinformation and propaganda and promotion of polarization and hatred. They support Trotskyist, lunatic left-wing groups and alt-right, wacko right-wing groups. Both of them. And indeed, when Greece had their coalition, red-brown government, Syriza and Panel, the Greek fascists and the Greek communists in an alliance. And who did they get? The Minister of Defense and the Minister of Foreign Affairs. A far right-winger and a far left-winger, both with connections to Moscow. And when the Minister of Defense had come back from Konstantin Malofeev's wedding in Moscow, he came from the airport and went to the Syriza party headquarters. I wonder why. I wonder why. Because he got the instructions, create a coalition government and go to Syriza, the people allegedly you hate. But what they hate more is us, the defenders of liberalism and open, tolerant societies. So we need to combat this polarization, this hatred of our neighbors that is being promulgated. And there are politicians in Europe and America who are very tight with the Kremlin, who admire it. Former President, thank God, Trump, admires Putin. He thought this was the best real estate deal of the century. This great country, all this land, it was like describing a real estate deal. I admire him, he's smart. But we have to be very careful of these people. And Viktor Orban, another one, but not the only one. So that is a way to combat it within our own political systems to defend liberal democracy.
Sorry, last question.
Okay.
Vika from Georgia. So my question is concerning, in 2008 in Georgia we had a war with Russia, and everyone agrees right now that West didn't do their best to help us, and right now our government is obvious for everyone that it is pro-Russian, but people of Georgia are not pro-Russian. So how do you see future for small nations in current world order in terms of liberty? How can we survive and finally become independent from communism?
It's a hard question, particularly with a small country such as Georgia, where a big petrostate can have an outsized impact on the country, but also try to think of ways to combat the polarization. This is an appeal to the American right wing, which is in love with Putin also, by the way. They say, oh, they're against the woke left. And now it turns out, like my Hungarian friends who worked at Foundation for Economic Education and are laissez-faire free market advocates have been called by the Orban government communists. They're communists because they believe you shouldn't beat up gay people. I know that's a crazy position. Not beating up gay people is insane. But now we've seen this in Georgia, where they turned the radicals in the Georgian Orthodox Church, unleashed them, and said, if we have this democratic approach, everyone will become gay. It's true. Everyone will be a lesbian. Even the men will become lesbians. But this is a very powerful tool, and we need to be thoughtful and creative how to respond to that. But this polarization that's going on is very effective, and the Kremlin is really utilizing it. And unfortunately, let's take the US, the idiots on the far left fall right into it. They just go along with it. And we have to think carefully about how to propose a free society in which people can have traditional values and more bohemian values, and we can live together in that free society. That's part of our challenge to do that. Our time is up, so I want to just ask our friends from Ukrainian Students for Freedom to stand up. You are not alone. Thank you.